I'm Emily.
And I'm Amelia.
And we're the co-founders of Wildflower Delivery Co, a modern sewing kit company. Today, we're sewing our wrap pants. To make this project, we'll be learning and practicing three main skills: constructing a garment with French seams, making cutaway inset pockets, and interfacing and top stitching a waistband.
So let's jump in.
The kit comes with everything you'll need to complete the project. Access to step-by-step illustrated instructions corresponding to the steps in this video, fabric yardage custom printed with the textile print you chose and the pattern piece templates, and a notions kit with a preloaded bobbin, matching thread, sewing pins, snap closures and hook and eye, hand sewing needles, some interfacing, a hemming tool, and just in case, a seam ripper. There are 3 additional tools you'll need to complete the project. You'll need a sewing machine, an iron, and scissors. Before we jump in, I'm going to explain a little bit about the style. The pants have a wide leg, cropped silhouette with front pleats, cutaway pockets, and a fold-over tie waistband with a top stitching detail. And just to give you an overview before we start, I'll go through the basic steps to complete the project. I'll start with the front panels, and I'll pinch out the pleats, tacking them into place. Then I'll sew the pocket halves together and stitch those to the front panels. From there, I'll sew the left and right pant legs into tubes and then stitch them together at the center seam. Once the pants are together as a unit, I'll sew on the front placket and hand sew the snaps and hook and eye closures. Finally, I'll interface, sew, and attach the tie waistband and top stitch it to finish the project. I just want to add a few notes about our paperless pattern system before we cut the pieces out. The textile print extends all the way to the cut line of the pattern pieces, and the pieces are designed with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So, just to be clear, the seams are the lines of stitching that hold the pieces together, and the seam allowance is the extra space between the stitch line and the edge of the fabric that will end up on the inside of the piece. Because the textile print extends past that stitch line and into the seam allowance, even if you don't stitch everything perfectly straight, you'll never see a gap or any unprinted fabric. The fabric is also printed directly with notches, so there's no need to clip them in order to mark them. Notches are small marks perpendicular to the cut edge that act as guides while you're sewing. For this project, the notches help match up corresponding pieces, show where to make the pleats, and help line up the waistband. You also may notice a few pieces with borders that say extra fabric, not a pattern piece. For certain sizes and styles, we had small extra blank spaces when we laid out the pattern pieces, and in those cases, we filled them with a little extra printed fabric. We won't use them for this project, but we hope that they find their way into a future creative endeavor of yours. So, the pattern templates are printed directly on the fabric, and now I can just go ahead and cut them out around the lines. So I've cut out the pattern pieces, and I'll just point out who's who before we get started. The front and back pant pieces are similarly shaped, but the front panel has a jagged top edge that will be folded into pleats. It's a little bit wider and has this cutaway shape at the side seam where the pocket will get sewn in. The slimmer set are the back pieces, and just to orient you, this is the side seam, and this curved edge is the crotch seam that'll go around the butt and extend to the front. Now, these 4 pieces are pockets. So they have the same curving shape here, but they're a little bit different on this edge. This cutaway matches the cutaway on the front piece, and we'll be sewing there. And then this that doesn't have the cutaway is actually going to extend the front piece to complete that side seam. Now we have these 2 rectangle pieces, and they'll be stitched together to become the tie waistband. Lastly, this little trapezoid will be folded in half and sewn, and it will become the placket where we attach the snap closures. So we're now at the steps where we'll start using the sewing machine. And if you're brand new to sewing, check out our Sewing 101 video, and we go over all the basics there. The front panel of the pants have 3 pleats on either side, and we'll start with those first. So pleats are a device that create 3-dimensionality and extra volume in a flat piece. We're able to add extra width in the pant leg without making the waist measurement larger by folding that extra fabric width into the pleats and catching them in the waist seam. The pleats are marked with these angled notches that end in half arrows, and the arrowhead direction indicates the part of the fabric that will be pinched out to become the pleat. You can also see with this jagged edge that sort of indicates that pleated section as well. So the gently sloping side is the center front, and the side with this little cutaway, that's the side seam. This is important to know because once I've pinched the pleats out, I'm going to lay the excess over towards the side seam, and you'll be able to see that when the garment's finished, the excess will be in one direction, and you want that to be matched and even on both sides. So match the first set of notches, and then folding the fabric at the notch, sandwich that excess over and push it towards the side seam, maintaining the cut edge evenly at the top, and then pin that into place. So I'm finding those notches, matching them together, and then folding the excess over. And it's going to line up evenly at the edge. That's why this edge looks so funky, this jagged edge, because it's accommodating for that fold. So I found that one, matching my next notch up and folding that over. And then matching that next one and folding that over as well. Just gonna pin that top edge. Now you can see I've repeated this with the second and third pleat on the front. And when you look down at the piece from the top, it looks like a sort of offset accordion fold. Those waves are going under, over, back and forth like a little saw edge almost. So I've pinned that, and with this pinned into place, I'm going to bring it to the sewing machine and stitch along the top edge at 1/4 inch just to hold these pleats in place. Now on my machine, the small divot in my presser foot marks 1/4 inch. This might be indicated slightly differently on your machine, so be sure to measure for 1/4 inch, and then you'll know where to line that up. So I'll just stitch down this edge, pulling the pins out as I go. So here now I have the pleats, they're held into place, and all of the folds are pointing in the same direction towards this pocket cutaway. So then I'll repeat the same thing on the second piece, making sure to mirror those pleats and fold the excess over to the side seam edge. Now that the front panels have their pleats sewn into place, I need to sew the cutaway pockets. So the pocket halves will be stitched together around this curved edge and then fit into the front panel and be attached along this edge here. So this will be sewn, and then this curved edge will be sewn, and that will create the pocket, and then the second larger piece of the pocket will actually extend the side seam of the front panel. And once that's all together, the front panel will be complete. I'll start by stitching the pocket halves together. And I'm going to use a French seam for this connection to nicely finish the seam allowance edge. So a French seam is essentially a seam where the seam allowance, which is traditionally exposed on the inside, gets encased in a second row of stitching so that the raw fraying cut edge is no longer exposed. It's a really simple, clever stitch that's super useful for unlined garments. The main thing to be aware of with a French seam is that you start by stitching the pieces with the right sides facing outward from each other. It's really easy to go on autopilot and start with the right sides together, which is how you position pieces with a simple seam. So just double check. So I'm positioning my pocket with the right sides facing outward and the wrong sides facing each other. And every time you do a French seam, you're going to set up the pieces with that orientation. So I'll start with one half of my pocket, and the seam allowance for this piece or for this entire project, is a 1/2 inch. But because we're using a French seam, which are made of 2 rows of stitching, for the first row, we'll stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then later, when we do the second row, also at a 1/4 inch, the collective seam allowance will equal that 1/2 inch that we've allotted on the pattern pieces. So I'm going to start by pinning this curved edge and then stitching around this edge of the pocket at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So just lining up this shape, which lines up on its own because it is kind of a mirrored shape. And I tend to put a couple extra pins on the curved areas because those are less stable than the straight of grain areas. So it's easier to kind of have them get a little change shape. So I've pinned around this entire shape, and once again, I'll be stitching just from this top edge. This is actually where it's going to connect into the waistband, around this edge, up through this little section here, and this side here is where it's going to connect into the side seam. So we're just doing that free pocket edge at the moment. So back to my sewing machine, and I'm going to be lining it up with the divot on the foot that marks the 1/4 inch. And for this seam, I am going to do a back stitch to start and finish. So I have this seam sewn at a 1/4 inch, and now I'm going to trim the seam allowance back to 1/8 of an inch and press it flat. Then I'll open up the pocket and turn it and press the seam allowance to the very edge of the fold. I'll show you how to do that in a moment. So I'm trimming this down to 1/8 of an inch all the way around. And if you don't want to use your seam gauge to measure it, you can tell you're basically just trimming it down by 1/2. So you can eyeball it really easily. So I'm going to be pressing this, and I'll just press it from the side that we sewed it, and then I'll be turning the pocket inside out. And I'll use my hands and a pin if I need to sort of help pick out this seam, because we want the stitched edge we just made to end up being the very edge of the fold. So it's harder to do this on a curve than if you were doing this on a straight seam, and like little sections can kind of get like tucked up inside. So you can either use a pin to sort of pick it out, or I sort of like to use my fingers to sort of like roll the seam so that the stitch to edge is at the very edge of the fold. So you can kind of position that, and then you'll press this flat. And making sure that that stitched edge is all the way out of the fold helps maintain the correct seam allowance and the correct shape of the piece. Because if a whole sort of section gets tucked up in there, then the piece no longer has the correct shape. So I'm just going to pin this new edge into place, and then I'll take it to the machine and sew my second line of 1/4" stitching to complete my French seam. So when I sew the second line of stitching, it's actually going to be encasing the seam allowance inside the channel that I'm creating along the edge. That's why it's important to trim that edge down to 1/8 inch so that it doesn't catch in this new line of stitching and have the frayed seam kind of poke out of our new seam to the outside of the garment. So I'm going to stitch this, and then I'm going to repeat that same process for my second set of pockets. The pocket shapes are now sewn together, and we just need to attach them to the front pieces. So take one pocket, and with the right side of the smaller half facing the right side of the front panel, line up the curved edge with the mirroring curved edge on the front panel. Because the left and right sides are mirror images of each other, if the pocket doesn't fit right here, you just have the wrong one. So just swap it out and the other pocket will fit to the other side and you can find the right pocket for that side. So I'm just going to arrange this on that mirroring curve and then I will pin it into place. So now I'll stitch these pieces together along this curved edge at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. It's a 1/2 inch because this isn't a French seam. So we're using the entire seam allowance in just this one line of stitching. So this pocket edge is stitched, and before I turn the piece and press it, I'm going to trim the seam allowance down to 1/8 inch. We're doing this for two reasons. When you turn a curved seam, the seam allowance will either be too large and bunch, or it'll be too short for that new curve and it'll pull. So the seam allowance, when we make it narrower, has a less extreme difference between the length of the cut line and the stitch line. So that helps it turn and lie flat when we turn it. You can also clip into the seam allowance to help it lie flat, but trimming it down will help us finish the edge cleanly on the inside because I'm going to make a double row of top stitching at 1/8 inch and a 3/8 inch along the edge. And those top stitches will actually encase that 1/8 inch seam allowance inside the top stitch so the raw edge won't be visible. So trimming this guy down to 1/8 inch. And then I will just press it from the stitch side, and then I'm turning this so the right sides are to the outside, and that we can use that same technique where we kind of roll the seam out. And we'll press that into place. So I press the pocket over, and to stabilize this edge and encase the raw edge, just like I mentioned, I will top stitch this curve and I'll do 2 rows, one at 1/8 inch from the edge and the other at 3/8 inch from the edge. So I'm going to do the 1/8 inch one first, and I'm just lining up that folded curve with the 1/8 inch part of my foot, and I'll stitch around that edge. Then I'll do my second row, lining up the folded edge with the 3/8 inch mark on my sewing plate. So this pocket is fully installed into the front piece, and I'll repeat the same process of attaching the other pocket to the other side, and then our front panels will be ready to attach to the back panels to create the pants. During this step, the pants will really start to take shape. I'm going to sew the right and left pant legs separately and then connect them together through the center seam. So we'll be using French seams for all this construction because the pants are unlined, so French seams will give the inside a beautiful finish. So take one of the pant legs and line it up with one of the back panels, wrong sides together so that the shapes roughly mirror each other. Again, if this isn't possible when you're arranging things, you just need to swap the pieces out for the mirror image piece. So remember, we want wrong sides together, so I'll flip my front pieces to the wrong side. And then I'll take my back piece and with the right side facing up such that the wrong sides are together, I'm lining the pieces up. Like I mentioned, like this is incorrect, so I just need to switch this and put this piece over here, and then that curved crotch seam does line up here and the side seams line up on this side. So I can just roughly arrange my pieces to make sure I have my pant legs in the right place. And I'll set this one aside and we'll start with one here. So now I'm going to line up the side seam edges and the inseam edges and pin them. And the side seam is a little unruly because of this pocket. So if you want, you can pin this pocket edge to the side seam, and that'll just sort of help secure that into place so that the side seam is like one solid straight line. So I have that as my front side seam, and I'll line up my back piece and pin all the way down this edge. And especially when you're pinning large seams like this, I like to secure it at the top and secure it at the bottom, and then kind of pull it flat and pin the middle, and then sort of pin like half and half again, and that helps get the seam lined up evenly. So I have that side seam pinned into place, and then I'm pinning in the inseam. So I'll start with where this curved edge kind of makes that sharper curve. I'll line that edge up, and then, and this is going to be like the center crotch part of the seam, and then this is the bottom hem here. So that in the middle, Perfect. So my piece is pinned down the side seam and pinned down the inseam, and my pocket, as you can see, that's how the top of my side seam looks. Pinning the pocket edge, catching that sewn pocket area, and then down onto the rest of the pant. And now, like we did with the French seams of the pocket, I'm going to sew down these seams at 1/4 inch, and then I'll trim them back to the 1/8 inch, turn the piece, press the seams out, and then make the second row of stitching at 1/4 inch to complete the seams, and we'll have a finished pant leg. So I'm trimming these entire seams that I just sewed at 1/4 inch back to an 1/8 inch. So we just trimmed the seams down to an 1/8 of an inch. And before I turn it inside out, I'm going to press these seams flat. So we didn't really do this when you were working with the French seam on the pocket because it was curved and going to stay inside out because it's inside of the pant. But here we're basically going to press this seam open and flat. What we're trying to do is get the fabric as like flat and open on that stitch line as possible. So I'm sort of using my iron as an anchor and then pulling the other side of the fabric to press that seam over. And this is a little bit easier if you're working on a traditional ironing board where you can put the pant over the ironing board and only work on that top surface. So that's actually an advantage there. So I pressed the side seam, and I'm going to do the same thing with the inseam, just working on the other side and kind of offsetting that seam so I have a flat surface to work on. And then pulling the fabric. So now that these seams are pressed flat, I'll turn the piece inside out and then kind of arrange those seams such that the stitch line we made becomes the edge of that fold. And I'll use my fingers to kind of roll that out. And then I can pin it and press it flat. So exact same process that we did on the pocket. It's just feels a little bit different because it's a long straight seam and not that smaller curved shape. So I have my side seam pinned, and now I'm pinning my inseam, doing that same process of sort of rolling the seam out so that the folded edge is the stitched edge. So now I can take this back to the machine and I'll stitch the second line of 1/4 inch stitching that will encase our 1/8 inch seam allowance inside and create that nice channel on the inside of the seam allowances and a finished simple seam on the outside. So I'm pressing this from the stitched side, and then I can kind of offset these seams and I'll press them flat. And I always press my seams to the back side just to be consistent and put the bulk in one direction. So I'm sort of holding the fabric and using the iron to press that over. And I'll do that the side seam as well. And the side seam will also be pushing it to the back, which is more important because it's kind of the direction that this extra pocket fabric wants to go in anyway. So Awesome, so those are pressed flat, and then I can turn this piece inside out, and we have 1/2 of our pant leg all sewn up, and you can really get a sense of how this pocket works. Looks like that. This will all get caught in the waistband, and then your hand goes in the pocket right there. So this is all sewn and ready, and I'll do the exact same process on the other pant leg, and then we'll be able to join them together. So you now have 2 separate pant legs, and we'll attach them together. This will be a simple curved French seam going from the front to the back. But before we sew that, I'm going to finish the raw edges of the first few inches of the front pieces, where I'll insert a fly placket later. So basically, I'm going to finish these edges by folding them over twice as narrowly as possible and top stitching them. We've included a great little tool to make this step really easy. So on the front panel of the leg, you'll notice a notch, and this indicates where the fly opening is going to begin. So from the notch all the way to the back side here is going to be a French seam attaching the 2 pieces. But from the notch to the top edge in the front, those will remain separate, and the halves will both be finished with that turn finishing method that I mentioned before. So I'm going to finish those edges first, and then also the connecting French seam to put the pant legs together. Now I want this edge to be as narrow as possible, and this tool makes that incredibly easy. Basically, this ribbon is made up of a grid-like structure with a little open frayed edge on one side. So I'm going to line this edge up with the raw edge of my fabric on the right side and make a line of stitching through these little teeth, connecting it to the fabric below from the top edge to the notch. And the important part of this row of stitching is that I don't ever cross over into the grid structure on the left. I also want to make sure that I maintain a consistent distance from the cut edge, because this line of stitching won't show, but it is dictating the width of my folded edge. This line of stitching holds the tool in place for the time being so that it can help us with the next step. But because the stitches are just over these open teeth, when I'm finished, I'll be able to slide the tool right out of the hemmed edge. It's super brilliant, and it will make way more sense once we see it in action. So, lining this tool up with that raw edge, and I am going to stitch a little bit past that notch, just like probably 1/2 inch past that notch, because we want the edges to be finished all the way past the notch, and then the notch is where we'll finish our French seam. So lining this up, and I'm stitching in the open teeth area. So I'm stitching about 1/8 of an inch onto my piece. I'm stitching right past my notch and ending about 1/2 inch from the notch. And you will have an extra length of the turning tool, so don't worry about that. So now this line of stitching is holding the turning tool in place, and I'm going to fold the turning tool and then fold it back again. And essentially what's happening is that line of stitching is creating our fold line, and the little teeth are stabilizing this and kind of dictating the other side of that. So from the edge of the teeth to the stitch line is the width of our folded hem. So I have this folded and folded. The raw edge is encased inside of here. And now I can take my piece back to the machine, and I'm going to be stitching from the other side, the end here where the notch is, and I'll be stitching on the wrong side where I can see this fold, just stitching right along the edge about 1/8 of an inch. So So now this turning tool is stitched into place, and I was stitching from this side, but you can see on this other side I just have a nice edge stitch, about 1/8 of an inch. And this is the super magical part. I'm basically going to gently slide the turning tool out of this seam, and the turning tool is free, and then that folded edge is stitched into place. Now I'm going to repeat this on the other front panel to finish the other side of the fly opening, and then we can attach the pants together. So now the raw edges of the two sides of the fly opening are neatly finished, and I can attach the two pant legs together along this seam. So this is a French seam. So again, I'm going to start with the wrong sides together. And the easiest way to do this is to take one of the pant legs and turn it wrong sides out. So we see the wrong side of the fabric and the right side is on the inside, and then take the other pant leg and keep it with the right sides out. Then nest the two pant legs together such that the wrong sides are facing each other. So I can just kind of like put my hand through this one that has the right sides out and sort of feed this one in there. And what I'm ending up with here is the pant legs are kind of nested inside of each other, and I'm able to line up this crotch seam, and the wrong sides here are facing each other. So I'll start by lining up the inseams, and I'll pin those into place, and then I'll just line up the cut edges all the way up the back and pin those. There are a couple notches, you can line those up just to make sure that the spacing is even. And then I'm going to be pinning the front, and we hemmed the edge a little bit past the notch because we're going to be sewing this French seam up to the notch, and we want to like that edge hemmed past that notch so that there isn't like a break between the French seam and where we hem that edge. So I'm just going to pin this at that notch, which I can see here. And that's where we're going to like officially stop the French seam, and that's where the fly opening will open down until. I'll bring this over to the machine and I'll stitch all the way around and do that at 1/4 inch, and I'll be starting at this notch. Because that's hemmed, I'm not starting 1/4 inch from that hem, I'm sort of starting at that edge. And as soon as I go past that area that is hemmed, it'll line up with the 1/4 inch of the cut edge of my fabric. So this is stitched from the notch, and you can see how I mentioned that it's 1/4 inch from the cut edge, but it sort of lines right up to where we hem those edges at the notch. Then it's 1/4 inch all the way around to the back, and I'm just going to trim that seam down to 1/8 of an inch. so that I can complete the French seam process. So I'm just trimming the edge up where the raw edge exists, and I won't trim the part that we hemmed. Just ironing this out, I'm pressing the seam allowance, that trimmed seam allowance, over to one edge by sort of separating the fabric. It's a little tricky because this is on the curve, so you might just have to adjust your fabric so that you're not ironing over the back side. And this will be easier on a regular ironing board. So to sew my second row of stitches, I'm going to turn it inside out, and I'm going to nest that other leg back down inside of here. So the right sides will be together and the wrong sides will be facing out, but you still have like nice access to this seam. So once that's turned, I can kind of wiggle that folded edge out to the edge and pin that into place. So this is all pinned, and then I can take it to the machine and sew that second line of 1/4 inch stitching, and I'm starting that line at the notch that indicates where the fly opens down until. And I'm definitely going to give this a back stitch where I'm starting it. So our two pant legs are attached together at this front to back crotch seam, and then we left the top section open the amount that the fly is opening, so you can put the pant on and off. And this is where we're going to attach that placket and our sewn on snaps. So we can turn this right side out and see that the pants are really starting to turn into pants. So our next step is going to be sewing that placket piece and installing it. Now that the pant legs are connected and the fly opening has these beautifully finished edges, I'm going to make the placket piece and then insert it to the fly opening. So to do this, I'll find the small trapezoidal piece, and I'm just going to fold it in half down the middle and match that sloping edge. And you'll see that that edge has a little set of notches. You can match those notches as well. So I'll pin down the edge and around across the top and the bottom. And then I'm just gonna stitch all the way around this piece, but in the space between that little set of notches, I'm going to leave that space open. So I'll leave a gap in my stitching and stitch around the rest of the shape. So I have this pinned, and I'll take it to the machine, and starting at the fold, I'll stitch across the top, down the edge, back stitch, leave a gap, and then stitch around the rest of the shape, all at a 1/2 inch. And the gap that I'm leaving, that's where I'm going to turn the piece right side out. So I'll just leave that little space for myself to turn the piece. So I have the piece and it's stitched around these 3 edges with the gap in the middle on the long tapered edge. And now I can trim the corners back at a 45-degree angle. I'm going to trim across those corners and across these corners as well. They're on the folded edge. Trimming that out just ensures that when I turn it, there isn't a lot of bunched up fabric trying to exist in those corners. So trim those out, and now I can turn the piece by opening it at the little gap that I left and kind of grabbing the fabric, pushing it out of that hole. So you're just turning the entire thing so that you can see the right size of the fabric. And it'll start to take shape, and the last thing that you'll be turning is kind of those points. And you can sort of use your fingers to kind of like shimmy them out, or you can also grab a pin. Sometimes this is helpful. Sort of use the pin to pick that seam out so that the point is a nice sharp point. And you can feel like if we hadn't have trimmed that fabric out, there'd be a lot of like bulky seam allowance in that corner. So that's why we trimmed that. So yeah, just push all of those corners out, and then we'll press it flat. So I've pressed the placket piece flat and pressed the seam allowances under where we had that gap. And now, to finish this piece, I'm going to top stitch around the 3 sides that are fully closed. So the top edge, that folded edge, and the shortest bottom edge. I'm going to top stitch that at an 1/8 inch from the edge, and I'll leave the side with the gap unsewn for now. So just edge stitching these 3 sides. So to attach the placket, we're going to line up the wider end of the sewn piece about 5/8 inch from the top edge of the pants. And we're working on the left side. So this is the left side when you're looking at the pants, not the left side when you're sewing or when you're wearing them. So I'm taking that piece and lining it up 5/8 inch from the top edge, and I'm underlapping this finished edge about 1/4 inch, and I will pin that down this side, and my placket piece will then extend past where the pieces are open into the French seam about 5/8 inch. So just pinning that overlap into place here. So I have the placket and it's pinned with the left side of the fly opening, and it's about 5/8 inch from the top here, and it extends into that French seam area about 5/8 inch, half an inch. So I can take this to the machine and top stitch this, and I'm basically just following that top stitching line that I can already see. That's the finished edge of the fly opening. I'm just going to do a line of stitching over the top of that and follow that line, so you won't actually see two lines of stitching. It'll just be kind of over the top of that line that's already there. So put this in the machine, and I'm going to start from the top edge and then sew down to where the front piece is split. And to make this easier, I'll fold back this other half, kind of fold it down, and that'll expose the area where we're going to stop. So I'll just have that out of the way. So I have my piece in here, and I'm lining it up so that my needle is going to fall directly over that line of stitching that I made to finish this edge. So this line of stitching I'm making now is going to attach the placket, and it's also going to sew over that gap that we left in the piece. So it'll achieve both of those purposes. And as I near this, I can pull this piece back, and I'm just going to sew up to that edge where these overlap. And I can backstitch there. So my placket is attached here, and then I'm going to do a couple extra things to finish this off. So I'm going to fold the top piece over and stitch across this intersection here. This gets a lot of stress, this connection, when you slip the pants on and off, so stitching across there will help with that. And so I can just slide this under my machine and stitch across there, and we're folding this top piece over like that, as if this seam that we've sewed here is kind of extending. So that's how that's getting oriented. And then I'm just gonna sew neatly across there, like 1/4 of an inch, and I'll go back. So you can see that line of stitching is going across from our seam about 1/4 of an inch. And then finally, to finish this off, I will stitch this folded over. And to do that, I'm going to fold this over, and I will start at this connection and stitch down from where the pants split. So I'll fold all the other layers under, and then I can put that into my machine, and I'm just stitching up like 1/8 of an inch, and this stitch is just folding this edge back and over. So I'm putting my piece in, and I'm gonna stitch from this connection here down to the edge. And all my layers are pressed back except for the layer I'm sewing. So now I have this folded and stitched, and that's secured there. And basically that, now when it overlaps here, it's just extending this seam edge up, nice and like visually it's extending that seam edge. And we'll be attaching our hand sewing snaps to this edge here and this edge here. So these extra layers of the fold edge and the placket will help give the connection for the sew-on closures like some nice structure. So that's an added benefit there. So the fly and placket are sewn and completed, and to finish this fly section, we're going to add some hand sewn on snaps and hook and eye. The pants themselves, what like holds them on is the big fold over tie waistband that we haven't added yet, but what closes this fly area is these sewn on closures. So they're going to be 4 snaps, and then at the top there'll be a hook and eye. And the snaps are going to be 1.25 inches apart. So I can use my printed seam gauge, and starting at this bar tack here where the pants split, I'll measure up 1.25 inches and mark that with a pin, and mark up another 1.25 inches. Mark up another 1.25 inches. And then lastly, we're doing the 4th one here, and then there's a little space at the top, and that's where we're going to put the hook and eye. So the way that I'm going to do the snaps is I'll sew on one side. Snaps have the 2 sides. There's the side that kind of has like the hole, and then there's the side that has the little pin head, and those fit into each other. So I'll take the like bulkier side of the snap. That's the one with the hole. And I'm going to sew that onto this placket side. And I'll sew these on first, and then once those are in position, we'll mark the position for the other half from that. But it's best to sew one half on before marking the position for the other half. So I'm going to take some thread from my machine, and I want about like an arm's length, and we're going to use this thread doubled up. So I'll thread my needle. Helps to just kind of pinch the end of the thread. Make sure you've just clipped it so there's no frayed edges. Pinch that between your thumb and forefinger, and then you can kind of just slide the needle over the top of that. So then I'll pull the tails out to meet each other, and I can I'll hold the tails between my thumb and forefinger, wrap my finger around loosely, and then I can slide this. It does help to lick your finger. Slide this and then kind of pull that down, and that makes a nice fat knot. If there's like an extra loop, you can kind of cut that off. So I have my thread. I have this snap marked off where I want it to go, and I'll start from this side. The knot will get covered with the snap, so that's kind of the cleanest way to do it. I'll start here, and we're just positioning the snap basically directly over the intersection between the placket and this seam, because when this fly is up, we want that snap to be fully invisible. So I'm going to put my needle in basically right where that seam channel is, and that's where I'm going to start. And then to sew these snaps on, you're just sewing up and down, and these basically have 4 little holes in them, and you're going to stitch at least 4 stitches around each of the 4 holes in the edge. It's important to really tack these on nicely because they will get some stress. So I'm just going around the edge and then grabbing a bite of the fabric underneath. You can pull the pin out so it doesn't catch on the thread. And that's 2 around. Then I'm going for a 3rd and a 4th. And then now my next bite, I'll put the needle into the fabric, and then I'll come up so that I'm positioned under the next hole. And then from there, I will do 4 stitches around that edge. And just kind of go around the snap like that. Oh, I've gone around my last hole 4 times, and then I can just put the needle through the fabric one more time, and I'll pull it out from the back side here, pressing it through, pull it out, and then I'll tie this off from the back side. So the way I like to tie a needle off is by taking a little section of my fabric and pulling out, so I have this like small loop here, and then I'll just put the needle through the loop like twice, and then I can pull that, and that creates 1 knot. And then I always just create 1 more knot by taking my string out, making a big loop, putting the needle in through twice, and then kind of pulling that loop down. I'll put my finger on the top, and then I'll pull the excess, and that creates like a nice tight knot. And lastly, I'll just put the needle in, and I'm only going through the very back layer of this fabric. I'll put the needle in and then just bring it out like 1/4 inch away, and then I'll trim the thread off right when it comes out of the fabric, and that just sort of buries the tail. So we're not relying on the knot right there. We're putting the tail in and clipping it right off so it doesn't come loose and be in the way. So that's our first snap that we sewed on. And then to give it, to sew its second half, I can basically fold the fly up and mark, I'll use a pin to mark where I want the center of that, like the little hat of the snap, to lie. So I'm doing that pin marking, and that's the center of where I want the corresponding section to be. And I'll be stitching it from this folded side here. And we're going to attach this in the exact same way, just being a little bit more cautious because we don't want the thread to show on the front side. So when we're taking those little bites of fabric and sewing around the holes around the edge, I only want to go through like the first few layers of this folded edge and not ever see my needle on this top edge. So when I'm taking those, I'll just kind of double check and flip back and forth and make sure that my needle isn't coming out and putting lines of stitching on the front where we can see it. So I have sewn the 4 snaps down my fly closure, and I have the snaps on the placket side and then the corresponding snaps here. And when those snap up, the overlap for the fly opening is essentially invisible, which is what we want. To finish this off, I'm just going to add a hook and eye at the top. So you've probably seen a hook and eye on a piece of clothing that you own, and they're usually located above the zipper. And the purpose of them is they just give structure to like a lateral tension. So if you don't have the hook and eye, the zipper could just kind of come undone, whereas the hook and eye kind of protects that and keeps the fabric from pulling laterally. The same is true here. Without the hook and eye, if this has any sort of stretch this way, the snaps will just come undone. But once we attach that hook and eye, that sort of pressure point is secure and the snaps will stay in place. Same situation with a belt or with a button at the top of a fly on jeans. That button holds it in place so that the zipper is sturdy. So with the hook and eye, we really are going to use a very similar technique to attach it. So have a doubled up thread on my hand sewing needle, and then there are two different parts. There's the part with a little hook shape, and then there's this little bar, and the hook will kind of click into there and pull against that bar. So I am putting the bar side on the placket, and then I'll be putting the hook side on the overlapping section such that it can pull on the bar when it's done. So starting this off in the same way, just take my double-sided thread that I've knotted up, and I'm putting this at the very top of the placket. And in the same way that we went around the edge of the snap 4 times, I'll do the exact same thing here. Going around the edge of the bar 4 times on one loop, and then 4 times on the other, and then tying it off. So, and then once this is in place, I'll just be able to match the location of it on the other side of the fly for the hook portion of the hook and eye. So all the closures are nicely attached to the fly placket, and we can set this aside for the moment and focus on the waistband. The waistband is the last piece that really brings the pants together and gives the style its signature big bow on the front. So I'll start by ironing the interfacing to the belt piece. Now, interfacing is a stabilizer that adds structure to certain areas in garments. It's often used in waistbands and collars, plackets, or on any area that needs additional stiffness. For this project, we're using iron-on interfacing, which has 2 sides. One is smooth and the other is slightly bumpy in texture. The texture is a heat-activated adhesive that bonds to the fabric when you apply heat and pressure with an iron. It's important to be extra careful and double-check which side of the interfacing you have against the fabric, because the heat will cause it to melt and adhere to whatever surface it's touching, whether that's the face of your iron, your ironing board, or any place you don't want it. So we'll lay the interfacing piece out flat with the bumpy adhesive side facing up. Then we'll take one of the waistband pieces and make sure to iron out any wrinkles. So just ironing super flat. And these pieces are mirror images of each other, so it doesn't matter which one we use. You can take one away for the time being, and then we're just going to be attaching the interfacing to one piece. So I have my belt piece super flat, and I'm going to be laying it over the interfacing right sides up, so that the bumpy side of the interfacing is touching the wrong side of the fabric. And then I'll just line that up. The interfacing piece might be slightly larger than your waistband piece just due to the differences in the sizes. So if so, you can just trim the interfacing down to fit the fabric edge. And it's best to clip this off before you introduce the iron, so you don't risk the iron accidentally hitting the interfacing directly. And if you do have to trim anything, make sure to get rid of those scraps right away so that they don't accidentally attach to your iron while you're working on your project. Now, I'm going to iron from the fabric side up without steam. So I'll turn my iron to the steamless setting and iron from the fabric side. And I like to start in the middle of the piece and kind of place the iron on the piece in a single area and let it sit there for a few moments, and then move it over to the next area. I'm just kind of tacking that in place. It's important not to drag the iron or pull it across the fabric, because it can cause the fabric to sort of stretch as it's fusing to the interfacing, and then it'll end up puckering as it unstretches. So I'm just going section by section, putting a little pressure, but never dragging it across the fabric. And this can take a few minutes, which is totally okay. You just want to make sure that you're getting a nice, even adhering of the fabric to the interfacing. And once you've tacked it in place, you can kind of move the iron around, but you really want to be pretty gentle about it. So for the waistband, take the 2 rectangle pieces and notice that one of the long edges has a bunch of notches while the other only has a few. We're going to match the corresponding edges up and then pin the side with the fewer notches, pinning along that whole edge and then down the short side, and then along the opposite edge, stopping at the second notch, which I've marked with a pin. Should be about that distance from the edge. So mark that notch with a pin on both sides, and I'm just going to be lining these up and again pinning along the whole other side and then stopping at that notch. As you're pinning, you might notice that the interfacing is a little bit coming up on the edges. That's okay. Once you stitch the waistband, that'll be holding the interfacing in place. So it's hard to get it fully on everywhere, and that's fine. So this here is that notch, so I'm going to be pinning that. And I'll just give myself a double pin there so I know that that's where I'm going to stop sewing. The corresponding notch on this side. So this is all pinned, and the only part that's not pinned is this center section. And that's going to remain open for this step because we'll be using that to attach it to the top of the pants later. And the width of this gap is actually the same distance as the top of your pants that you've already sewn. So starting at one of my double pins, I will stitch around the entire piece at a 1/2 inch seam allowance and until I get to the other side with the double pins. So I'll give this a back stitch. Give this a back stitch here, and then I'll move down along this edge. And as I approach the corner, I'm actually going to stop about 1 stitch away from that corner point. And when I get to that 1 stitch away with the needle in, I'm going to pick up the presser foot and turn my fabric, pivot it 45 degrees. Then with the hand wheel here, the balance wheel, I'll make 1 single stitch. And then with my needle in the fabric again, I'll turn that fabric another 45 degrees. And stitching the corners like this actually helps give them a much sharper point when we turn the piece inside out. So every time I hit a 90-degree angle, I'll sew the corner in that way if I'm going to be turning the piece inside out. So now that I've sewn the waistband, I can trim the corners off at 45-degree angles and then turn this piece right side out. Trimming these angles allows the corner, when we turn it, to not have all this like bunched up fabric in the corner. So I've trimmed my 4 corners, and then using the gap that we left in the waistband, I'll just reach up and grab this kind of edge and sort of wiggle it out, and then do the same thing on the other side here. And then just to get these corners pushed out, kind of use my finger to sort of push that from the inside, and then you can kind of use your 2 fingers to sort of like wiggle the corner out to a point. And I'll do that on all 4 corners of the waistband. These nice pointy tips on my waistband. So once I have this pushed out, then I can lie this flat and press the waistband flat. And I'll use my fingers to sort of roll that seam out so that I have the waistband flat and that there isn't any tucks right at that seamed edge. And you can feel the interfacing really does give it some nice structure, and then when we top stitch over the top, it just becomes this really cool structured tie, which is a really fun element of these pants. You'll notice that the interfaced side really does want to like lie out flat, but the other side kind of wants to curl under. So just be sort of aware of that. So I have all the edges pressed nicely, and the last thing I'm going to do is press the seam allowances over in that gap that I left. So I'm just going to press these down 1/2 inch on the interfaced side. And I don't have to worry about pressing the other side, but I'll fold this interfaced side over and press that kind of as a continuation of the sewn edge. Now I have this all pressed out, and it's time to join the waistband to the pants. So I'll line up the raw free edge of the waistband, the side that isn't interfaced and pressed over, with the top edge of the pants, right sides facing together. And before I pin the pants to the waistband, I want to pin the pockets and the pleated section back into place. So it's going to end up looking like this, and basically I'm just pinning this whole section over. So I'm lining the pocket up with the pleated edge and then pinning that into place. And it should meet the very finished edge of the placket opening. So lining that up. Basically I'm making sure that the pleats and the pocket are the same length, and that finishes in this folded edge here. And I'm just pinning this edge, which will now represent the waist here, and now represents the like right length for the waist. So I'm pinning both of those sides. Such that the pocket is now flat against the front panel. So I want to pin that, and now starting with the center of both, I'm going to match the center back seam of the pants with the center of the waistband. So there's a notch there, but I could also just find it by folding the waistband in half and finding that center mark. So I'll line the center up with the center back seam of the pants, right sides facing together. And then I'm just going to pin the waistband to the top of the pants, matching any notches and seams all the way around. And this should line up all the way around, and the where we started the gap in the waistband will line up with the edge of where the pants placket opens. So and when I get to the part where I pinned that pleated pocket section into place, I can just remove those pins and add this last layer in there. Now when we get to this edge here, you can just clip into that seam allowance a tiny bit, and that'll help line this up, because the seam allowance wants to go one way where we've already sewn it and wants to go the opposite way where we're about to sew it. So just clip into that, and that'll help you stitch it. I'm also being mindful of which direction my seam allowance is going. So I want the seam allowance towards the back for the side seams. So I'm just putting a pin in there, pinning it in the direction that I want to make sure I stitch it in. So this is all pinned into place, and my waistband fits perfectly with the top of my pants. And now I'll take it to the machine and sew at a 1/2 inch seam allowance to connect the waistband to the pants. Sewing from the waistband side here helps you keep track of this second half of the waistband so that it doesn't get caught underneath, and you can kind of use your hand to keep that out of the way as you're sewing. It can be a little tricky to get this seam going because you're starting in an area that has sewing right before it, but get it as close to that area as possible. But we're also going to top stitch this into place, so if it doesn't line up perfectly, that's fine. So I mentioned when I was at the machine that you want to start this line of stitching as close to where the edge of this fabric is as possible, but it's a little hard to get in here. So I actually started mine like a 1/2 inch in, and that's totally fine because our next step is going to be pinning this over, and then we're going to be top stitching this whole thing. So the fact that this isn't attached with top stitching with my original line of stitching is okay. So the waistband is attached to the pants, and the next step is top stitching around the edge of the waistband, which will attach the other side of the waistband to the pants and enclose this raw edge. So I'm going to pin the lining edge of the waistband such that it overlaps slightly the stitching line we just made to attach the waistband to the pants. So it'll overlap that line just about like 1/8 of an inch. And then when I top stitch around the entire edge of the waistband, 1/8 of an inch from the edge, this line of stitching will catch that lining and secure it down. I'm going to stitch this from the front though, so I'm going to pin it here and then I'll transfer the pins to the other side so that when I'm sewing, I can remove them easily. So this is a little bit tricky just because the pants are a circle now, so we can't work on a really flat surface, but I'll start this by finding that center by folding this in half, and then I can pin that center into place and go from there. So I'm pinning from this inside, and then once it's all secure, I'm going to switch those pins to the outside. So I have this pinned down, and I can't see that line of stitching that connects the waistband to the pants, and that's good. That means it's overlapping enough that when I stitch from this side 1/8 of an inch to the inside of that seam on the waistband, I know that it'll catch that. So the final step before I do that top stitching is just transferring these pins to this top side. So I'm sandwiching all the fabric between my fingers, slipping out the pin, and then just replacing it on the top side. Because this is a blind, like I'm stitching this kind of blind, I'm catching what's on underneath without seeing it, I will add like a couple extra pins more, have my pins closer than I normally would. So with all these pins transferred, I can take it to the machine, and I'm going to be stitching that 1/8 of an inch to the inside all the way around the waistband. So the line of stitching will attach the inside of the waistband in that gap that we left, and then it'll just give the waistband a nice edge finish everywhere else. Doesn't really matter where you start, but I'm gonna start on this section where I want to be most careful, where I want to attach the inside to the piece.
Show the pocket. Oh. Okay. That is the pocket. Do you want to show your hand can go inside of it?
So I've been sewing around the edge at the 1/8 inch mark, and because we're sewing in a rectangle, at some point as I'm sewing this, the bulk of the pants will want to be in this like really awkward small space. So as I got to this corner, I'm going to pick up, and I realized that as I'm stitching down this edge, these pants are all going to want to be there. So that's fine, but if you're uncomfortable with that situation, you can always just pick up your needle and start on the other side where you started your line of stitching and just stitch from the other edge. So I'm finding that point where I started, and then the bulk of the pants is over here, and as I go around to meet where I just left off, the bulk of the pants will stay outside of my machine. So either one is fine, it just might be a little easier to pick it up and start from the other direction. So now that the edge is stitched around 1/8 of an inch, I'm going to finish the waistband with parallel rows of top stitching. Those will give added structure to the waistband and a really lovely visual texture. So everyone's belt's width is a little bit different based on the size of the garment, and the density of parallel stitchings is sort of a personal preference. So you can use your printed seam gauge to mark out the width of your lines to make sure that they'll be even. I like to fold my belt in half to find that midpoint because that's where I'm going to start working from. So I'll find that midpoint and put a pin in. And then I like the spacing about 5/16 of an inch between the lines. And that fits really nicely on the belt. So I can pin that into place just to make sure that that is a good amount of spacing. And yeah, I definitely recommend just kind of visually spacing this out so you set yourself up to have this look really even on your belt. So I'm marking this along my printed seam gauge, and that's looking really good. And then I'm gonna actually take these pins out when I sew. I just wanted to make sure that that spacing was gonna look nice. So I'll take those out and I'm going to start with my middle line. And before I sew, I'm going to pin these 2 layers together in a few spots down the waistband. Because one layer is interfaced and the other layer is not, the uninterfaced side has a tendency to stretch a little bit more. So pinning the layers together helps the fabric stay in the same place as I'm stitching it and it doesn't kind of offset it. So I'll just pin that kind of to either side of that middle line. And this will prevent the top layer from kind of pulling, and as I stitch down the waistband farther, it'll get more and more offset. So pinning this is a really good way to prevent that. And we'll just leave these pins in as we're sewing. And I'm actually going to be stitching from what looks like the inside of the garment. You can see the wrong sides of the pant. This is the inside. But the way that the pants actually fit is you kind of roll the tie belt over. So technically this actually sort of ends up on the outside when you're wearing it. So it doesn't really matter which side you stitch on, but that is why I'm stitching from this side. Now to sew, I'm going to start with the middle row of stitching, and I have that marked with a pin, so I'll just note on my machine where that lines up to when I place it under my needle. So if it's on your plate, you can put a little piece of tape there so that you can maintain that even distance. And when I'm stitching, I'm going to be starting 1/8 of an inch from the edge where that edge stitching kind of makes a border on my waistband. So I'll start there and I will give it a little back stitch. Nothing crazy, but you do want to secure the start and finish of your seam. And then I'll just stitch all the way down this center seam and then continue my parallel stitches from that side. I'm being pretty cautious not to be like dragging this through, and that's helping. I'm kind of pulling it from the sides rather than pulling it front to back, and that's helping the 2 layers remain together. I'm also being careful to adjust the bulk of the pants because I don't want that to get caught and kind of pull on this. I really want to maintain a straight line because this center line is what I'm basing the rest of the parallel lines off of. So I have that first line of stitching done, and then, like I said, I'm going to base the rest of my parallel lines off of this one. So I'm using the width of my foot here, from this to here. That's sort of my 5/16 width that I'm basing this off of. So that's a really nice thing for me to use to line up. Just the edge of my foot is always going to maintain the same distance to this line. And if you want, you could also move your tape over to that new edge, but this is going to be an easier thing to follow. So then I'm just going to continue this parallel stitching all the way out to the edge, and then I'll repeat the same thing, but lining this up with the other side of the foot and do my parallel stitching all the way out to this edge. So once I have a couple of parallel lines from my midline, and I'm starting to get closer to the edge, what I like to do is move that piece of tape over and line that up with my edge. And basically, because we've been lining everything up based on this midline, if I started to get off a little bit, that off can kind of compound. So as I'm getting closer to the edge, I want to make sure that I'm actually an equal distance from this edge before I'm too close and it gets a little awkward. So I'll just sort of reevaluate and make sure I still have a good plan for how my spacing is going to go here. So just put these pins in just to kind of double check, and I like to do this while I still have sort of wiggle room if I need to make a couple lines slightly closer together and make them a little bit farther apart. It's like easier to space that difference out when I still have a little bit of room to move. So I just put those pins in, and I'm really liking how this is looking. I'll have these 3 more lines of stitching. So that's great. I kind of feel reassured. And instead of focusing on this line, lining up with my foot, now I'm going to be focusing on this line. I still want to double check here, but I really want to make sure that I'm even to this edge and that I didn't start sewing kind of diagonally at some point lining up this middle line. So yeah, I'm just keeping an eye on the distance between the tape and the edge of my fabric, and it looks like I have been sewing pretty straight because this is also maintaining that nice line. But see right here, you can see that this did get a little wider, and so I'm lined up here, but this is a little bit narrower here, and that's okay. Like within these lines of stitching, you won't really see that, but I just want to mitigate that that sort of off-kilter line before I get to the very edge. So I'm going to line this up again, and I know I'll do this one more row of stitching and then a third row right there. So I've completed all the parallel lines of stitching, and now I can trim off these tail threads right along the edge. And you can see that the waistband has a lot more body and structure and will create a stiffer tie now that we have this parallel lines. So it really becomes this like cool statement element. And now that that's fully constructed, we'll move on to hemming. So now we'll hem the pants. The pant style is meant to be a touch cropped, but because everyone's legs are a different length, we decided to include extra length just to be sure the pants are long enough for our collar makers. At this stage, I recommend trying on the pants and kind of playing with the length you like. You can fold the hem under and pin it to various lengths and look at it in the mirror. And once you've decided on the length you like, keep the pins in and slip the pants off. So I tried these on in the mirror and I marked this length. So with the garment inside out, I'll turn these two pant legs inside out. I can look at where I pinned, and this is my desired finished length. And then I'll take my seam gauge and I'll mark up 2 inches from that desired finished edge. So 1, 2, and then I will mark that with a pin. So our hem allowance is 2 inches. So I'm going to crop my pant off to this pin, which is marking my hem allowance. So to do that, I can either measure with my seam gauge this distance all the way around and mark that with a pin, or I can use my fabric as a guide. So I'll trim down to that pin mark, and then I'll start to cut across. And I can just use, we can unpin this now that we know where that is. I can use the fabric I cut off as a guide to show me the width I'm cutting off, I'm removing from the bottom edge. So, and I can either do that by pinning that, or I can kind of cut this and continue to fold it back and use it as a guide. So it's just a good way to kind of use the tools around you to measure this. So I've trimmed one side of my pant leg down to the desired length, which is my desired finished length plus 2 inches, which is the hem allowance. And then I'll take my offcut and I can repeat the same trimming process on the other leg using this offcut to mirror the trimmed length. So do that same thing, put it down here, put a pin in it, and then I'll cut up that seam to the pin. And then cut around the pant hem. So once the pants are trimmed, we can hem them. And to make the hem, we're going to fold 1 inch of the raw edge away from the right side. So we're on the wrong side, and then we're just going to fold the hem back 1 inch. We can use the seam gauge to measure this. The easiest way to do this is to do this on kind of one side of the pant leg and then do it on the other side, and then kind of pull between them and sort of naturally folds it down the right amount. So I can kind of go like this And then I want to make sure, but that's like a nice way to get that started. And looks like an inch, that's great. I'll check my other side. This is a little shy here, so I'll just bring that up. Inch. And before I fold this up again, I'm going to just trim out this side section here. This is going to get folded up again, so I can just take some of this seam allowance out, starting at that fold, trimming up the seam allowance like this, and that just helps reduce the bulk at this seam edge, this hem. So I've trimmed those, and I'm going to press this. And then I'm going to fold it up again 1 inch, and that has the raw edge fully enclosed and concealed within this hem. So then I'll pin that into place and make sure that everything is evenly 1 inch all the way around, and then press that. And you can hem with this method at, using any hem allowance, but by doing this with a full inch, folding over 1 inch and another inch, we're giving the hem weight, and it helps the pants kind of fall really nicely. So that's why we're doing this sort of deeper hem. So this is nicely pinned all the way around, and I'm just going to give it a little bit of a press to help that stay in place. And then I'll take this over to the machine, and I'm going to be stitching from this side. I'm going to be stitching about 1/8 of an inch from the inside of the fold towards the hem. And to make this easier, I'm going to actually take the bed of my machine off, and then I can slide the pant leg onto the machine, and it just makes it a little bit more mobile by taking that piece off. So I'll start my line of stitching at one of the side seams. The inseam is nice. And give it a back stitch, and then I'm going to stitch around the whole edge, and that will secure the hem into place. And then I'll repeat the same process with the other leg, and we'll be finished. So I just completed my second hem, and now my pants are completely finished. Thanks so much for sewing with me today. I hope you had fun and learned a few new sewing skills. I brought Amelia back to show off our completed wrap pants project. These pants are so cute, worn over a leotard, the way Amelia has styled them, with this dramatic waist tie and the flowing pants. We always get compliments when we wear them out and about.
So we are Amelia and Emily, the co-founders of Wildflower Delivery Co, and we look forward to sewing with you again soon. So please see the link below to check out our other sewing kits on our website and subscribe to our channel to stay in touch. Goodbye for now.